Well, first of all, I want to thank the Center for East Asian Studies for this invitation. To everyone here that I've met so far, I am giddy. This is my first in-person research talk in over 2 years. Really. It feels like 17 years, and I hope that I remember how to do this in person. You know, I'm not wearing pajama bottoms, so I think that's a good start. So I'd like to start off by taking us back in time, not to 17th century Ming China just yet, although we'll spend much of our time together there. First, I'd like to take you back to my 2001-2002 academic year, spent studying Mandarin at the inter-university program at Tsinghua University in Beijing. My host father was a retired Tsinghua University historian, and as his former and current students affectionately called him, a literatus. The books in his apartment bookshelves were triple and even quadruple stacked. And my host father had read and even memorized, or at least consulted all of them. He invited me to use any book I needed. As my language skills developed, I enjoyed slowly reading works of history, psychology, and linguistics. My host father's office adjoined my room, and I often stopped to interrupt him at his work to ask him a question or two about translation. Even after I completed my language program and moved to another apartment, whenever I came across a linguistic or historical puzzle, I consulted him first. One day, an emperor's dream puzzled me and pushed me to recognize my linguistic limitations and kindled my interest in Ming dream divination techniques. Indeed, this dream in particular led to a decades-long study of Ming dreams. One of the dream interpretation examples is from Chen Shiyuan's late 16th century Guidelines to Dreams and Dream Divination Encyclopedia. In this particular dream interpretation example, before ascending the throne as emperor, the Qi Shizu emperor, who reigned from 440 to 493, apparently dreamed that he climbed to the top of the Taizhi Palace stairs while wearing a pair of mulberry clogs. In the narrative, according to an unnamed old man's interpretation, the type of wood used to make the clogs would determine the dreamer's fate. He stated that the Chinese character for mulberry comprised 4 tens and 2 dots, and thus at the age of 42, so 4 tens equals 40, plus 2 equals 42, the dreamer would attain the position of emperor. This indeed came to pass, just as predicted in this earlier dream, which I've given here. Back in 2002, I read this entry and I reread the entry. I looked up the unknown, at the time, unknown to me, Chinese characters in my paper dictionaries back in the day. But I couldn't figure out the relationship between the character for mulberry and the disparate graphic elements in the Chinese character for 42. Back to my host father. His eyes lit up with delight when he read this passage, and he raced into his office and returned to the living room with a large variant character dictionary. He smiled and said, "This would not have been necessary for a Ming literatus, but I think you'll find it helpful." Interpreting the character for mulberry, as printed in the encyclopedia, required knowledge of an alternate form of the character for mulberry, which is also pronounced sang but written differently, and here you see it. This version of the character, written in running script, was derived from clerical script and conventionally used by scholars. So here we have 3 tens, and then you further break this down into a 4th 10 plus 2 other marks equals 42. This alternate character knowledge, as I later learned, was only one of many techniques in the so-called literati toolkit. A certain level of learnedness on the part of the dream interpreter and also the reader was required, as we saw in the Mulberry example. Although I then did not have the tools in the literati toolkit, my host father did and guided me to begin building my own toolkit. As we will see in other dream interpretation examples, dream interpreters also employed subjective analysis, which necessitated sensitivity to both individual and collective context. Dream interpreters used specific techniques, but used these in creative combinations rather than according to only one predetermined logic. These dream interpreters, with their specialized knowledge and training, may have felt much like powerful stand-in interpreters for the late Ming literati, who had access to the same specialized knowledge and training. The late Ming dream encyclopedias that republished dream narratives did not explicitly explain either the toolkit of techniques or the cultural sensitivity that allowed for dream interpretation. Its audience possessed these tools already, thanks to the style of education and training they received. The assumption in the Ming, and earlier too, was that without dream interpretation techniques, these dreamed glimpses into knowing were not as easily accessed or understood either by the dreamer or the interpreter. Thus, today's talk explores the invisible scaffolding of dream interpretation techniques that were not explicitly introduced in late Ming dream encyclopedias, but were nonetheless clearly used in creative combination. The audience knew these techniques, and the assumption is that it offered glimpses into knowing the past, the unfolding present, and the future. Multiple dream interpretation techniques, glyphomancy, resonances, symbolism, offered dream interpreters the means to wield interpretive power. Some dream interpretations, such as this one that puzzled me so long ago, from the Qi Shizu emperor, offered justification for rule. Others granted legitimacy to rulers or exposed disloyalty. The unifying thread here is first and foremost the techniques. Yet, threading in between the techniques are the ways in which the dream diviners utilized the techniques in the practice of dream divination. The techniques conferred power upon those who used them and helped the late Ming literatus who had the knowledge and skills to make the world orderly and intelligible. These techniques were not newly invented or even newly understood in the Ming. However, the cataloging, organizing, and approach to knowledge was particularly Ming. The dream encyclopedias contained dream narrative examples that relied upon these dream interpretation techniques, and literati had textual access to the practical, technical, and subjective knowledge that allowed dreams, their own, and also dreams of people in the past, to be taken seriously. I'm going to focus on 4 elements in the late Ming literati toolkit. So we're going to start with glyphomancy, move on to historical resonances, symbolism, and then end with subjective interpretation. I should be clear that there are many other tools in the toolkit, of course, homophonic resonances and visual resonances, to name just 2 examples, and I'm happy to talk about those more in the Q&A. These techniques, I should also say, were not set in stone, nor were the boundaries so particularly demarcated. Indeed, it was up to the subjective understanding of the dream interpreter to select the appropriate techniques needed to understand a particular dream. Without this literati toolkit, the dream interpreters could not have interpreted or divined the past, let alone the present and the future. With the subjective know-how to choose the appropriate techniques, the dream interpreter's craft stepped into the realm of the numinous. The literati in the late Ming did not explain these techniques or tools, but could appreciate and understand the power of interpretation, explanation, and of making sense. So before we dig into the techniques in the toolkit, I'd like to give an introduction to the primary source in a little bit more detail. After a Mid-Autumn Festival dream, Ming literatus Chen Shiyuan compiled a work of 8 juan, a word often translated into English as volume, that was republished several times during the Ming and Qing and also included in another late Ming dream encyclopedia, minus the explicative commentary. And here the second work is listed, published in 1636. Because Guidelines for Dreams was republished and quoted in later publications, this work is a good example for us to focus upon today. I'm going to use it as a lens through which we see the creation of a textualized past, compiled through recorded dreams. This particular encyclopedia is but one source of many that reveals the ways in which dreams were a source of self-knowledge, knowledge of the past, knowledge of the real, and knowledge of the unreal. An exploration of this work offers us in the 21st century an understanding of the ways in which a liminal experience was transformed into a permanently textualized event, a part of a history that was simultaneously personal and collective. Chen Shiyuan's preface to Guidelines for Dreams dates the work to 1562. It likely circulated in manuscript form, and then the work was published in 1582. Altogether, there were 30 chapters, organized into 10 inner and 20 outer sections. The inner sections covered explanations of dreams and dream interpretation, including the mechanisms by which people dream. It is the outer sections to which we'll turn, which comprise most of the work, in which Chen Shiyuan cataloged and quoted from nearly 700 dream examples, culled from a variety of historical sources and included the corresponding interpretations. These were all drawn from texts that Chen would have studied, read, and perhaps even memorized. Historical treatises, poetry collections, bibliographical treatises, and the organizational format too reflects an early modern fascination with categorization. The work as a whole really, I think, relied on the cumulative weight of individual examples of accurately divined dream interpretations to prove that these techniques worked and should be used. The encyclopedia incorporated a broad spectrum of texts, genres, and literary modes drawn from multiple sources, thus representing a layering of textual translations that were reorganized thematically. The dream narrative examples were taken from sources that were extant separately from this late Ming publication. The literati compilers, such as Chen Shiyuan, did not invent the dream narratives, nor did they fictionalize accounts through playwriting or poetry, as did some of their contemporaries. Here, literati like Chen Shiyuan turned to what he knew how to do best, combing through memorized classical texts for dream-related passages, which were recontextualized and then put into renewed circulation. The encyclopedia quoted and highlighted ways in which techniques from earlier times were meant to tell us about the present. For Chen Shiyuan, dreams represented a certain form of knowledge which could be accessed, interpreted, and expressed in writing. As he stated in his encyclopedia, a dream is the wandering of the spirit and a mirror that reflects what is to come. A dream indicated what had not yet manifested, but would potentially and likely become manifest. There was an act then of meaning-making expressed through dreams and dream interpretation. So now we're going to turn to the dream interpretation techniques in the Literati Toolkit. We'll begin with Glyphomancy. This is perhaps the most technical of the tools employed by dream interpreters. So this is referring to the dissection of characters into disparate components with the purpose of revealing hidden meanings. This divination method has a documented literary and cultural history in a variety of contexts, from the Warring States period until the present day. Glyphomantic techniques have remained largely consistent. Characters can be split apart into constituent radicals. Strokes can be added to existing characters. Radicals can be deleted Two or more characters can be combined to create a new character. Chinese characters possess a number of strokes that map onto morphemes, and their meanings often but not always suggested by particular configurations. The late Ming literati who read these examples would have easily understood the techniques. Although dream interpretation was not a tested subject in the civil examinations, literati would have learned the semantic indicator or radical as they learned to read and write. The radical suggests the general class or category to which any given character might be thought to belong. These components often stand alone as individual characters, and some can be broken down into 2 or 3, 4, or even more constituent parts. Glyphomantic techniques required both literacy, but also a strong visual imagination, the ability to connect an intangible object with its various written forms. So here's just one example of the water radical with some sample words: river, sea, bubble or foam, and wave. And you can see this radical here on the top is included in each of these characters. So watery meaning is conveyed. Writing itself really imbued power and acted as a bridge between dreams and non-dreams, between what was not yet manifest and the potential for manifestation. The characters themselves acted as metonyms for all the phenomena and objects of the universe. As some scholars of religion have noted, Chinese characters were often regarded as the objects and ideas they represented writ small, and were believed to produce whatever condition they expressed. So, for example, if a character representing ghost or demon appeared, the character itself not only represented that, but embodied properties associated with that term. And in that sense, the character was as much of a ghost or demon as an actual ghost or demon. And the character revealed something essential about the visual aspects of ghosts and demons. And I think in that sense, you really see the entire topography of the cosmos could be held within characters. So changing the characters altered the cosmos. And I think writing, too, just had transformative power. At least to some, writing was not simply a recording of oral language, but an independent system of signs directly derived from natural processes. The vitality and dynamism were likened to the stars that actively correlated with human life. If the act of writing was transformative, it was also ordering. Writing characters offered control. Thus, the textual sphere in the Chinese cultural context should be taken not as a realm distinct or separate from that of ritual, but rather as part of it. Written forms of characters affected the non-physical unwritten form of dreams, underscoring the import of the written word within and without the dream narrative, and likely to become manifest. Many glyphomantic examples in the late Ming dream encyclopedias were fairly straightforward, even to a 21st century non-literatus like myself. For example, in one of the recorded dreams, there was a character who was serving in a commandery and dreamed 4 knives were suspended from the rafters of a building. So you can sort of take a moment and feel that in your body. Just close your eyes and imagine dreaming of 4 knives suspended from the rafters. And how does that feel? The dreamer, according to the written account, was terrified of the dream. But his subordinate congratulated him and told him that the 3 graphs for knife, here represented in parentheses, also comprise the character for region, and that the 4th knife in the dream is additional, signifying this 4th knife was a place name, Yizhou, and that the dreamer would someday administer the region, which indeed came to pass. Occasionally, dreamers use glyphomancy to interpret their own dreams. For example, we have another character historical character who dreamed of a pine tree growing out of his stomach. He told someone, the graph for 18 and Duke create pine, and he claimed he would become a duke in 18 years, and indeed it came to pass as predicted. Thus, not just for the dreamer, but for the literati readers of these examples, Glyphomancy offered a familiar means to align a situation, to make sense of something. Sometimes Glyphomancy was used to interpret the future of someone other than the dreamer. The dream thus bore meaning not just for the dreamer, but for someone connected to the dreamer, and this gets a little more complicated. So we have another example in the Dream Encyclopedia of silk thread hung over a mountain. So again, if you imagine what that dream feels like, the dreamer awoke and told someone the dream. The dream was interpreted that the graphical elements of silk thread suspended above a mountain form the character Yo, which meant that the dreamer would become an official in Yojo within the year. Indeed, the dreamer was appointed as prefect, just as the dream indicated. Unique to Glyphomancy, reading about successful interpretation offered confirmation to the putative reader of the encyclopedia that they too were knowledgeable, they too were in control. They understood this textual tool and could control it if needed. Thus, the literary persona of the dream interpreter connected characters, the dream, the dreamer, revealing truths about each that presumably made sense to the dreamer, which in turn made the dream interpreter and the literatus reader a controller of techniques, interpretations, dreams, and then by means of the previous three, the future. I'd now like to turn to the second technique in the toolkit. This is historical resonances. I had to put this in because I'm a historian. So, the symbols and allusions and resonances of the language acted as a means to bring the past to life. Right? The past was present for literati, and in an idealized sense, it helped guide and shape the present and the future. The past held power because it was a beacon for how to live, how to work, how to govern, and how to be. Whether it was actually followed is another question, right? But sort of in an ideal form. It also symbolized moments of glory for what the literati might have believed they stood for, upright men who, if not sages, knew the quality of a sage and what good rule should entail. If resonant language offered connections between dreams and non-dreams, then it might also offer connections between the past and the present, between a history in which literati and their knowledge mattered, and the unfolding present in the late Ming, in which it was increasingly unclear whether literati mattered. To truly be in the Ming world, we need to really understand and feel in our bones that the past was dynamic, accessible, and in that sense, alive. The past and present were not artificially divided, but had a really complex connection. Chen Shiyuan and other compilers like him were invested in this past, not just in the toolkits developed in the past, but in the world of the past as an indication of the future. In fact, literati in general were trained to concern themselves with intense experiences of the past. For learned men of this era, the past offered guidance. Earlier times reflected a time of idealized peace. Historical allusions and past anecdotes found life again, thanks to the importance of textual quotation and citation in literary analysis. Literati had access to dynastic histories, allusions from these dynastic histories, and stories from their years of education, and stories broadly defined the sort of the border between real and unreal, again, very blurred. In some cases, indeed, if a previous dreamer had a similar dream, the same dream interpretation held true again in the later dream. Again, in an example from the Dream Encyclopedia, there was a scholar who dreamed that somebody used a writing brush, to mark his forehead. At the time, someone congratulated him and said, "You will rule as emperor." The late Ming Dream Encyclopedic publication, Guidelines for Dreams, showed that an earlier king also had a dream like this, and an earlier dream interpreter had asserted the dream would mean the dreamer would ascend the throne. Thus, the later dream interpreter used the past example as precedent to interpret the later dream. Thus, historical knowledge was powerful. Nice for many of us in the room to hear. If a dream offered an association to a particular historic precedent, a trained dream interpreter cum literatus would understand the resulting resonance. The dream interpreter listened and heard the resonances. Next, I'd like to turn to symbolism. Symbols held weight and power in dream interpretation as well, and dream interpreters relied upon meaningful coincidence or synchronous correlations that varied according to symbol and content, the logic of which was unexplained in writing but nonetheless implied in the encyclopedic entries. For example, Li Shengmei, a governor during the Tang Dynasty, dreamed that his head turned into the head of a tiger. When he awoke, he was unhappy about his dream, perhaps because of the unnatural transformation, although this was not clear in the recorded dream narrative. His wife asked him if he had dreamed that his head turned into a tiger head. He answered in the affirmative and then wondered, how did she know about this dream? She said that she dreamed the same dream. Her head also transformed into that of a tiger's. And then she said that she was happy about it because the symbol for a ruler is the dragon and the symbols for his officials are tigers. Thus, according to her interpretation, a tiger head dream intimated that her husband would soon become ennobled as an official. In fact, 10 days later, the emperor summoned Li Shengmei and appointed him Grand Counselor of the Right. Both Li and his wife were ennobled just as their tiger head dreams as predicted. As we see in this example, the dream interpreter relied on knowledge of symbols to predict political appointments. The assumption was that the encyclopedic readers understood the symbolism. The entry does not explain the tiger symbolism or why tigers were metonyms for officials. Chen Shuyuan did not add his own explication either, presumably because he understood the symbolic connections himself. If the ruler was a dragon, officials were tigers, then the dream made sense. Partial transformation into a tiger reflected an as yet unrealized, auspicious reality. Li Shengmei and his wife would be ennobled. According to their dream, in fact, they were already ennobled as tigers. So their dual transformation in the dream offered legitimating weight to what Li Shengmei's wife knew and what came to pass. What is significant in this dream interpretation example is the dream was recorded as though the dreamer, the dream, and the interpretation were all integral parts of a system of knowledge. Even the same symbols appearing in different dreams were not necessarily interpreted in the same way, but depended on the individual context. For example, and this is an oft-cited dream interpretation example, and it's one that I love, so bear with me. A man thrice approached Zhou Xuan, who's a famous dream interpreter from the Three Kingdoms period, to request interpretations for 3 identical dreams of straw dogs. Zhou Xuan interpreted each dream differently. He purportedly explained the first straw dog symbolized sacrificial offerings to the gods, so the first dream implied the dreamer would attain food and drink. After a sacrifice is completed, the straw dogs are crushed under a wheel. So when the man brought a second straw dog dream, Zhou Xuan interpreted that it prefigured the man's fall from a carriage in which he broke his legs. After straw dogs were crushed, they're typically used as kindling. Thus, for Zhou Xuan, the third dream of straw dogs warned the man of fire. After the third dream consultation, the man admitted that each of the straw dog dreams was in fact an invention, that he had just been inspired to try to trick Zhou Xuan into giving false predictions and undermining his credibility as a dream interpreter. The man imagined the same dream ought to elicit the same prediction, whereas Zhou Xuan had given him divergent interpretations, and to the man's surprise and even dismay, each of the three dream interpretations came true. Thus, even an invented dream held weight, and the symbolic ties that bound the past, present, and future were still accessible to the dream interpreters. So I want to reflect a little bit more on symbols, thinking what is it that they mean in this context? It's, I think, something that holds meaning and something beyond meaning. They're not merely signs, but perhaps keys to allow the discovery of hidden meaning in a concrete situation, and often so subtly to state in specific or repeatable terms. Symbolizing implies the inquiry into hidden, or perhaps as yet unmanifested reality, as well as observing images in the mirror of the unknown or the as yet. The symbol then acts as a bridge between the dream and the future, or the past and the present. And a symbol mirrors the relationship between a dream, or, as the case of Zhou Xuan and the straw dogs, a relationship between an imagination and a waking life. Rulers whose dreams are included in guidelines for dreams also acknowledged shared knowledge about symbols to make political decisions. According to another entry, Jia Yinlin submitted a memorial stating he dreamed the sun fell from the sky and he supported it with his head. The emperor responded the dream indicated he was supportive of the ruler and thus appointed Jia judicial investigator of the capital. And here the emperor used the shared language of dream symbolism to recognize the dream as an expression of loyalty. If the metonym of the emperor was the sun, the central celestial body, then supporting the sun was equated with supporting the emperor. If the emperor reacted to the dream as though the dreamer supported him, then the dreamer too used the language of dream symbolism to gain a coveted position in the bureaucracy. Sometimes, this is back to playing with fire, symbolism augured danger for those who sought, consciously or not, positions of authority and power. One account related the dream of Zhang Jing'er's wife. She apparently told her husband, "In the past, I once dreamed my hands were hot like fire, and then you became administrator of Nanyang Commandery. During the following era, I dreamed half of my body was hot like fire. Then you were appointed magistrate of Xiangyang. Just last night, I dreamed my entire body was hot like fire." Unfortunately, a eunuch overheard her and reported the recent dream to the emperor, the same emperor, in fact, whose dream of the mulberry shoes brought him into the role. And a few days later, Zhang Jing'er was executed. So be careful. Unchecked political power, as predicted by his wife's dream, spelled his end. It's clear from this example that the dreams of others impacted the lives of and the futures of individuals who didn't have the dreams. Zhang Jing'er himself may not have had any inkling, dreamed or otherwise, that he intended to rebel against the emperor. But his wife's dream indicated he was a threat to the throne. Here it's unclear if it was Zhang's rise in rank or the implied symbolic association between the heat of the sun that demonstrated to the eunuch Zhang's desire for too much power. Either way, the account of the dream intimated his death, and Zhang's wife's dream reflected an unexpressed truth. Unfortunately, once she spoke to her husband about the earlier dreams, the palace eunuch connected her dream to potential treason, not on her part, but on her husband's. And here too, I think we also see the social aspect of dreaming and dream interpretation, and the impact of a dream was really felt beyond the individual who dreamed. Thus, dreams offered lessons, advice, and for the dreamer, the meaning of dreams was sometimes hidden in a symbol which they did not suspect. So the language of symbols takes objects that perhaps have a real existence, but which have become enigmatic or something beyond what they are in everyday life. And thus, symbols belong in the mental world, maybe even more than in the physical world when talking about dreams. The last tool in our toolkit for today is subjective interpretation. There was a legitimacy given to the recorded dream interpretations, really no matter who wielded the tools used in the interpretation, from the duke's court attendant to even the dreamer's wife, neither of whom served as official dream interpreters. I think that's a point of note. They did, however, possess enough knowledge of the techniques to tap into the meaning of the dreams. The techniques that I've discussed today acted as a shared language, a means of accessing a set of correlations between a lived life and an imagined life based on the messages of the past and depended on the attitude of the observer. Dream interpreters used this technique to mediate between the hidden and manifest, and I think, at least in these examples, to collectively understand the techniques as really exerting a liberating and saving effect because of the meanings they activated. A late Ming literatus's education prepared him to understand the subjectivity and the decisions that gave each dream interpretation its power. Sometimes dream interpreters used techniques in combination with sort of an understanding of the context of the dreamer's life. Also, in this dream encyclopedia, Chen Shiyuan recounted a historical anecdote demonstrating the right to rule was communicated in a dream that was accurately interpreted by a dream interpreter who understood the symbolism of the dream. So here's the dream. The Guangwu Emperor, the Eastern Han, dreamed that he rode a red dragon up to heaven. Consequently, Feng Yi and the other generals urged him to establish himself as ruler. So here's the locus classicus visually set off. The Guangwu Emperor summoned Feng Yi and said, "I dreamed I rode a dragon to heaven. When I awoke, I realized my heart trembled with fear." Feng Yi bowed and congratulated him. "Thus is heaven's mandate expressed through the spirit. Your heart's trembling demonstrates you have the vigilant and serious nature of a ruler." So therefore, Feng Yi and the other generals discussed the dream and agreed Guangwu should ascend the throne. In this interpretation, both symbolism and context played a role in arriving at the interpretation. Feng Yi's interpretation was driven by the presence of a dragon, the symbol for ruler, and the activity ascending to heaven, the site of power and mandate-bestowing force. Feng Yi also noted the post-dream attitude, right, of appropriate reverence and fear of the dragon. And thus the dream also legitimated the man who was later enthroned as emperor. Here, Feng Yi may have trusted his intuition about the character of the man who feared and respected his dream. The dream interpretation process was not then purely process-based, or indeed perhaps logical in the causal sense of the word. The inner logic was a spark, something mysterious or numinous that spoke through the dream and the dream interpreter. Now in the 21st century, we might imagine many alternate interpretations of this dream, interpretations that may or may not have legitimated the Guangwu emperor's rule. But the point here is not that dream interpretation was the one correct vision of anything, an emperor's rule, of treachery, but really rather that the interpretation was based on a subjective analysis, using context to determine one possible interpretation, and an interpretation based on shared values of the presumed audience. And it was really access to this shared symbolism and shared set of values that granted Feng Yi the authority to legitimate another's rule. Nowhere in the encyclopedia is there any allusion to this sort of cultural code, and neither did the subsequent literati compiler in the late Ming. But nonetheless, there's this subtext that runs through all of the dream narratives. There's another interpretive example that combined symbolism with glyphomancy that I'll share. The interpreter's choice to combine these two techniques was also really a subjective one. So here again, we have the example of someone seated in a great hall, and on top of the roof were 3 ears of grain. He leaped up and snatched the one in the middle and then lost it. Upon awakening, he asked about the dream and was congratulated. Grain located on the roof means a large official salary. Taking the middle ear of grain refers to a government position. If the graph for grain is combined with the graph for to lose, it forms the character that means official salary. Oh, I'm so sorry that did not appear. If you put grain on the left and to lose on the right, it should form the correct character. The late Ming literati who compiled and read these dream interpretive accounts did not need explanations for why a dream was interpreted the way it was. They knew the tools, they knew the techniques, and they knew the interpretive examples. They used glyphomancy, resonances, symbolism in combination to explain or understand the ways in which the past constellated in the present and potentially impacted the future. Sometimes dream interpreters used deception to affect or influence or determine a particular political outcome. And indeed, I think that really from maybe the 21st century perspective, looking at the interpreters who, from our perspective, are lying is also interested. The true interpretation of a dream really depended on the situational context. So the status and power relations between the dreamer, interpreter, and others shaped the interpretation, even if the effect was not explicitly acknowledged. I find that these moments complicate our contemporary understanding of contextual rightness. Here too, there's not really a right or a wrong answer, but a sense that the interpretation needed to align with the answer that was meant to be, or an answer that somehow carried resonances with the context and the audience, and maybe aligned with greater resonances. Engaging in dream interpretation, either as a dreamer or interpreter, implied a certain amount of risk, right? We have a dreamer who lost his life because of a dream told to his wife. Dream interpreters were historicized as visionaries who possessed technical and paleographic tools necessary to see into the past. The fact that some took this risk suggests it was perhaps worthwhile or necessary, maybe even unavoidable. I think it also indicates that dream interpretation was one means of asserting, imparting, or questioning legitimacy, as well as a means to understanding what might come, even when what was to come was perhaps unfavorable. Dream diviners acted creatively, using tools at their disposal to wield techniques appropriately. We unfortunately do not have the reactions of the dreamers recorded for posterity in these pages. We have the interpretations and the knowledge that what was interpreted indeed came to pass. The dream, the mirror, did not lie in that sense. The dream interpreters, skilled in these techniques and open to different aspects of interpretive experience, peered into that mirror. Late Ming literati, equally skilled in these textual tools and techniques, no doubt understood this and felt they too could peer into the mirror with deep understanding. And their educational experiences allowed them access to a past of Chinese characters, of resonances, of symbolism that permitted them a glimpse into their own dreamed future. Thank you.